And so what I think is important to realize is that when Asclepian medicine began, and it began probably about 600, 800 BC, or a little bit after Homer. In the time of Homer, he's still talking about Asclepius as a physician, and who had two sons who were part of the Trojan War. And so if we take that as the legend, the legendary Asclepius, the great physician, then that would be about 1300 BC around. And Hippocrates, who you all, I'm sure, know of, Hippocrates called himself a descendant of Asclepius in the 18th generation. Up until the time of Hippocrates, the Asclepian tradition was still a family tradition. The people who were family of Asclepius, descendants from Asclepius, are called the Asclepiads. And of course the case histories interest us a lot, because apparently with their treatment they didn't just treat what we call psychological illness. No, they treated physical illness, because people would bring to the sanctuaries little statues of what was healed, and we see feet and we see arms, and so the healing was a physical kind of healing next to probably also psychological. And the big change that he created was, he said, illness does not come from the gods. The gods are not the ones who send the illness. Illness comes from nature. So, physis. And every illness has its own physis. You have to find the physis, written physic, but then with an S in the end. You have to find the natural cause. So he was looking for natural causes. So he threw out much of the ideas that had existed before, that it was given by the gods. He started to look for physical causes, natural causes, physical causes, because physis means nature. So for natural causes, physical causes, and but the one thing that he didn't throw out, the one thing that stayed, and that stayed for over 1,000 years, was dream incubation. Dream incubation remained central to Western medicine from about 700 BC till about 500 AD, when the church ended it because they wanted to have the franchise on revelation. And what was happening was that Asclepian medicine works by way of revelation. It works by way of having the imagination reveal, and I will explain to you what I mean by imagination. Having the imagination reveal to you what the healing, where the healing would come from. So let me explain to you what I mean by imagination. As you've heard, the field that I have explored mainly in my life is a field called embodied imagination, the way that imagination lives as body. This is a field that was directly coming from C.G. Jung. Jung actually describes the birth of the field of embodied imagination in the Red Book. Why am I emphatic to call it embodied imagination? Let's go back to the Red Book and the way he describes it. So Jung here has just split up from Freud. He feels very isolated. This is a feeling. This is not a literal thing. He's surrounded by people. He's surrounded by the Zurich school. He's surrounded by tons of women. He's surrounded by people. But he feels very isolated. And in this state of isolation, he gets all these images that begin to overwhelm him. And here he is. He's professor at the ETH, which is like MIT. I don't know the equivalent on the West Coast. It's a very prestigious position that he's in. And here he is getting all these visions, and he thinks he's going psychotic. And then around Christmas of last year, 100 years ago, so a month ago, 100 years ago, he makes a very fateful decision, which I think has become important for all of psychology, and he describes it in the following way. He says, I let myself drop. And then what he describes, so this is the first thing, he let himself drop, so there is a moment of surrender. That's the first step in the whole work of embodied imagination. There's a surrender to another world. It is frightening. It is very frightening. What he describes is, I'm falling along a rock face. He describes the rock face. There are caves in there, and he describes the rock face. So it is an embodied presence that he's describing. It's a rock face. It is actually there. But the most important thing is, he says, when I land, I feel that I'm standing up to my ankles in mud. So the first experience of being present to this world is not with the head, it's with the feet and standing in mud. He's standing in a real world, and we have to speak a moment, we talked about the word real, right? The word real in German, of course, is very different from the word real as we use it. Because the word real comes from res, from the Latin thing. So when we use the word real, we speak about thingliness. That's the translation of reality, thingliness. Thingliness, because res is a thing. And when the Germans talk about reality, they talk about Wirklichkeit. Wirklichkeit is that which has effects. So it's a very different notion of what reality is. That which has effects, therefore, is real. And when Jung talks about the reality of the soul, he talks about the Wirklichkeit der Seele, about the affectivity of the soul. And so much of the stuff has gotten lost in translation. One of the things that has gotten lost in translation we owe to Strachey when he translated Freud, which is the word soul. Freud didn't talk about psyche. Freud talked about Seele, about soul. So when it crossed the Atlantic, it lost soul. So here with reality, we lose the sense of that which has effect. And the effect that of the reality of the embodied imagination is that it's physical. He can feel it with his feet. Not only can he feel it with his feet, with his body, the mud is embodied. The rock face is embodied. So imagination in its most pure form, and I take dreaming to be the most pure form of imagination. So I take dreaming, in a dream, the whole world around us is imagination. Right? Here when we sit, the world around us, yes, is imagination. We are imagining the world. Kant says without imagination you couldn't organize the world, so imagination organizes this world, but there's physical reality as well. So there's an interface between physical reality and imagination. In dreaming, there's only imagination. So that's why I take, I'm now not talking dreaming from the point of view of the current notions of brain and all that stuff, that's something else. I'm talking about the phenomenology of dreaming. I consider myself an aspiring phenomenologist. I try to be a phenomenologist, which I think is one of the most difficult things in the world, to be a practical phenomenologist, and I will tell you in a moment why that is so. As we are dealing with imagination through dreaming, then the first thing that you will notice is that an image is an environment. And that is very central to all my thinking. An image is an environment in which you find yourself. Just think about yesterday's dream. It was not primarily a story, you were somewhere. And that is, my interest has been to go all over the world to ask people, what do you dream, how do you dream about dreaming? I'm very interested in how different people's dream. And I've been in many different places, and there's one answer that always comes, and that to me has become the definition of dreaming. I was somewhere and something happened. So that is the definition to me of dreaming. An environment that can scare you, an environment where you can fall in love, an environment where you can taste food, an environment where you can smell terrible things when you go to the bathroom. All these kind of things happen. Your whole body is involved and you're living in a world that is a real world, and I call it a wild world. That's why one of my books is called Tracks in the Wilderness of Dreaming, because that is a world of untamed imagination. And untamed imagination is very frightening because we spend much of our lives to tame the imagination. That's what Jung did. He tamed the wild imagination with a whole meta-narrative about anima and animus and self and all these kind of things. Was a meta-narrative that he created to tame the wildness of imagination. So as a phenomenologist, I moved that out of the way. And I owe that to James Hillman because he spent his whole life trying to deconstruct Jung and get rid of the meta-narratives that are actually hiding the wildness of imagination and the creative force of imagination. When I speak about imagination, I speak about a reality. I speak about a reality that we encounter every night, and we encounter it much more than every night. We encounter it all the time. An Islamic scholar called Henri Corbin, who I met when I was assistant secretary to the Eranos Foundation in the 70s. And he always said that there was a great cataclysm that happened in Western culture, and it happened around the 11th, 12th century. And that cataclysm was that the culture moved from a Neoplatonic tradition to an Aristotelian tradition. The Neoplatonic tradition takes imagination as a reality, as a form of reality. It is a place. It is a place where you can go and a place where you can have vision, so it's a visionary tradition. It's a place, and it's a third place. There is the intelligible world, which now we would call either spirit, or we would call mathematics, or we call mind. And then there is the world of matter. And then for the Neoplatonists, there's this world in between, which is the world of the real imagination. That's a world in between that is equally real as the world of the intelligibility and the world of matter. It is an in-between world that is equally real. During the last 800 years, it dropped out. And as we became Aristotelian, which is a dualism, which has mind and matter, which created the mind and matter conundrum that we still are dealing with, the imagination became the opposite of reality. The imagination moved from a reality to Disney World. Disney World, but Disney describes it actually, that he doesn't like the endings of stories. I don't know if you saw the movie Saving Mr. Banks. He describes that he doesn't like the endings of the stories, so he creates imagination to get out of reality. And his whole Disney World idea is to get a place outside of reality. That is the epitome of the Western attitude to imagination as it has developed over the last 800 years. When we look 800 years back, imagination was a form of reality in which you could meet people, in which you could meet beings, in which you could encounter what were called the daimones, the beings that live in that world. And in many other traditions, like in the tradition that you were talking about in Brazil and many other traditions, they still have these daimones with which they are conversant. In our tradition, it has either become hallucination or it has become Disney. But there is not this sense anymore that Jung started again and brought back into the culture, that there is an in-between world that is equally real. And the question then is, can this in-between world that is equally real to the physical world, I call this the embodied world because they exist in embodied states, they exist in embodied presences, can this embodied world have an influence for us, or can it lead to us to medical applications that were similar to the applications that were brought about by Asclepian medicine? And the answer, of course, is yes, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you. I would be just very sad. I began to be interested in reviving Asclepian medicine basically because of an illness that I had, which made me spend about 11 months in the hospital, and then they couldn't find it, and then I went into analysis through many different roads. I ended up in analysis, and during my analysis, my illness, which is a chronic illness, which I still have, but all the symptoms disappeared. And the doctors now say, well, keep on doing what you're doing, you shouldn't be in this condition. So I found that working on images directly affected my body. So I became interested in Zurich already, in how that works. How does it work when you work on images in an embodied way? How does that affect the body?